What if some of Africa's biggest conflicts weren't just local struggles, but part of a much larger global war? After World War II, dozens of African nations gained independence. But instead of peace, many found themselves caught in a dangerous rivalry between two superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for control of the future. And across Africa, their competition fueled coups, rebellions, and devastating wars. The Cold War was supposed to be a conflict between Washington and Moscow. But for millions of Africans, it was fought much closer to home.
By the end of World War II, the world was entering a completely new era. The old colonial empires that had dominated Africa for decades were beginning to weaken. European countries like Britain, France, and Belgium had been exhausted by years of devastating war. Their economies were damaged. Their military power was stretched thin. And across their colonies, people were beginning to demand something they had been denied for generations: freedom. Across Africa, independence movements began gaining momentum. Leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens began organizing, protesting, and demanding self-rule. For many Africans, the end of World War II felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where African nations would finally determine their own future. But history rarely moves in straight lines. As the colonial system began to collapse, another powerful global rivalry was quietly expanding: the Cold War. The Cold War was not fought like traditional wars. There were no massive armies directly clashing between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, the conflict was defined by influence. Each superpower wanted to expand its political system and its global alliances. The United States promoted capitalism, democratic institutions, and market economies. The Soviet Union promoted communism, state-controlled economies, and revolutionary socialist movements. Both believed their system represented the future of humanity, and both feared the spread of the other's ideology. So instead of confronting each other directly, they competed for influence across the world. And Africa quickly became one of the most important regions in that competition. The timing could not have been more significant. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, African nations began achieving independence at an extraordinary pace. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule. Soon after, a wave of independence movements swept across the continent. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, Senegal in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Algeria in 1962 after a long and brutal war against French colonial rule. Within just a few years, the political map of Africa was being completely redrawn. New countries were appearing almost overnight, but these new nations faced enormous challenges. Their borders had often been drawn by colonial powers with little regard for ethnic, cultural, or historical realities. Many lacked stable political institutions. Their economies had been structured to serve colonial interests rather than local development, and their governments were still fragile. For the United States and the Soviet Union, this moment represented both opportunity and risk. Whichever superpower gained influence over these emerging nations could shape the future balance of global power. One of the first major Cold War crises in Africa erupted in the Congo. In 1960, the Belgian Congo gained independence and became the Republic of the Congo. It was one of the largest and most resource-rich countries in Africa, with vast reserves of copper, diamonds, and uranium. Its new prime minister was a charismatic nationalist leader named Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba had promised unity, independence, and control over the country's enormous natural wealth. But almost immediately after independence, the situation spiraled into chaos. The National Army mutinied, political tensions exploded, and the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared that it was seceding from the rest of the country. Behind the scenes, powerful economic interests were involved. Katanga contained some of the most valuable mining operations in the world. As the crisis deepened, Lumumba appealed to Western countries for help restoring order. When that support did not arrive quickly enough, he turned to the Soviet Union. That decision alarmed leaders in Washington. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, American officials feared that the Congo might fall under Soviet influence. Soon, the crisis drew in multiple international players. The United Nations deployed peacekeeping forces. Political rivals inside the Congo began maneuvering for power. Within months, Lumumba was overthrown in a coup. He was arrested and later killed under circumstances that remain controversial and tragic. The Congo crisis became one of the most dramatic examples of how Cold War rivalries could shape the political destiny of newly independent African nations. But the Congo was only one part of a much larger story. Across the continent, Cold War competition intensified political struggles and fueled conflicts. One of the longest and most devastating proxy wars occurred in Angola. Angola had been ruled by Portugal for centuries. But in 1974, a revolution in Portugal led to the rapid collapse of its colonial empire. Angola suddenly found itself on the path to independence. But instead of a peaceful transition, rival political movements began fighting for control. Three major groups competed for power. Each had different ideological visions and different foreign supporters. One group, known as the MPLA, received strong backing from the Soviet Union and Cuba. Another group, UNITA, was supported by the United States and by South Africa. What followed was a brutal civil war that lasted for decades. Cuban troops were deployed to Angola to support government forces. Weapons and military aid flowed into the country from multiple foreign powers. Angola became one of the most intense Cold War battlegrounds in the developing world. The war devastated the country's infrastructure and displaced millions of civilians. It would not officially end until 2002. Another dramatic Cold War conflict unfolded in the Horn of Africa. In 1974, Ethiopia experienced a major political upheaval when a military junta known as the Derg overthrew the long-standing imperial government. The new regime adopted a Marxist ideology and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, neighboring Somalia had also developed close ties with Moscow. But the balance of alliances soon shifted dramatically. In 1977, Somalia invaded Ethiopia in an attempt to seize the Ogaden region, a territory with a large ethnic Somali population. The Soviet Union made a surprising decision. Instead of supporting Somalia, it switched its support to Ethiopia, which it considered the more strategically important partner. Cuba again sent thousands of troops to assist Ethiopian forces. The United States, in turn, strengthened its relationship with Somalia. The Ogaden War demonstrated how quickly Cold War alliances could change depending on strategic calculations. Ideology was often less important than geopolitical advantage. Throughout the Cold War, Africa experienced dozens of coups and political upheavals. Military leaders seized power, civil conflicts erupted, and many governments struggled to maintain stability. Some African leaders attempted to avoid choosing sides altogether. They joined what became known as the non-aligned movement, which sought to remain independent from both superpower blocs. These leaders argued that newly independent countries should focus on development rather than becoming pawns in a global rivalry. But neutrality was often difficult to maintain. Economic aid, military support, and diplomatic pressure constantly pulled nations toward one side or the other. Foreign powers frequently supported governments that aligned with their strategic interests. Sometimes this meant supporting regimes that were far from democratic. In other cases, revolutionary movements received backing from outside powers seeking to expand their influence. Africa had become a complex and unpredictable arena of Cold War politics. Yet the story of Africa during the Cold War is not simply a story of outside powers controlling events. African leaders and societies were not passive participants. They made strategic decisions, formed alliances, and pursued their own visions for their countries. Some leaders believed socialist economic models offered the fastest path to development. Others believed partnerships with Western economies would bring investment and growth. Some experimented with uniquely African political systems that attempted to blend traditional authority with modern governance. These experiments were not always successful, but they reflected the determination of African nations to shape their own destinies, despite enormous international pressures. By the late 1980s, the Cold War itself was beginning to unravel. Economic challenges were weakening the Soviet Union. Political reforms and international diplomacy were changing. The global balance of power. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. With that event, the Cold War officially came to an end. For many African countries, the end of the Cold War created new opportunities. Conflicts that had been fueled by superpower rivalry began to wind down. Peace agreements were signed in places like Angola and Mozambique. But the legacy of decades of Cold War competition did not disappear overnight. Many nations were left with fragile political systems, heavily armed factions, and economies shaped by years of geopolitical struggle. The Cold War had reshaped Africa in ways that would continue to influence the continent for generations. Today, when people think about the Cold War, they often imagine the tension between Washington and Moscow. They think about nuclear weapons, spies, and political standoffs in Europe. But some of the most intense consequences of that rivalry unfolded thousands of miles away, in African cities, villages, and battlefields, for millions of people across the continent. The Cold War was not a distant geopolitical struggle. It was something that affected their governments, their economies, and sometimes their very survival. The Cold War may have been a conflict between two superpowers, but in Africa, it became a struggle that shaped the future of an entire continent, and its echoes can still be felt today.
Grow personally. Subscribe and join the journey to unlock your inner horizon.